I'd like now to introduce a special guest. We have Dale Wen here, who is a senior researcher a senior research fellow at Center for I'm on the wrong line, for the Third World Network in both Beijing and Würzburg. And you can explain a little bit more about that, Dale, who will give us an idea of what climate mitigation and climate action are looking like in China, and also the real facts and figures to present a clear picture for us. China's been mentioned several times throughout the seminar, and now we'll actually hear from an expert. Please, Dale.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
As Barbara has mentioned, that I really have been a world citizen for the last 2 decades, because I got my PhD in the United States and stayed in the United States for 15 years. And then I moved back to Europe together with my German husband. And so actually that's why when I go back to China, people don't treat me as a proper Chinese. They think I'm half westernized already. Well, so I'm kind of in the role of living in between. And so today I will tell you about China, and because it has been increasingly kind of impossible for somebody in the room to mention China whenever people talk about climate change. But unfortunately, there's really lots of spin and misinformation about China, which is not constructive for better engagement with China. So today I will start with some kind of debunking of some of the common narrative of the Western press, and hope to help you to better understand China, and also help for the West how can we better engage with China. So let me start with the US-China comparison, because one very common narrative during the international climate negotiations is the so-called US-China impasse, the so-called US-China deadlock. How is that preventing us from a rich international agreement? But let's first start with compare US and China first in terms of their responsibility and capability. Yes, China has grown a lot in the last 20, 30 years, but it's still a developing country when you look at GDP per capita. In terms of purchase power parity, China is between $5,000 to $6,000 per year. It's about 1/8 of the United States. It's still a developing country. And so people often say China has so much money. When you look at China's pretty big foreign currency reserve, but actually in per capita basis, it's only between $3,000 to $4,000. It's not that much, because China's power is really coming from its vast population. And in terms of emissions, China's emission has been growing very rapidly in the recent years, but it's still between 1/4 to 1/3 of the United States. And it's especially, the difference is especially big if you compare the cumulative emissions and the percentage of the global emissions. That really tells you how much the two countries contribute to climate change. And the United States, with less than 5% of the world population, responsible to 29% of the cumulative emissions, while China, with more than 20% of the world population, contributed less than 9%. And in terms of their capabilities, the US, as a very developed country, have all the basic needs met, and China has developed very rapidly, but there are still lots of areas they still need to address the basic development needs. For example, in terms of access to improved water sources, meaning clean drinking water, there's still 18% of the rural areas don't have access to reliable clean drinking water. For example, just 2 years ago, right before the climate negotiation in Tianjin, I visited one of my peasant friend who's doing organic farming in Hebei province, which is 3-hour train ride from Beijing. So his village has drinking water, but it only comes once every 5 days. So that's kind of the regional imbalance China still need to address. But despite that, China has less of responsibility and capability to deal with climate change. But actually, China is already doing more compared to the United States. For example, in terms of investment in clean energy, in 2009, China became the world's largest investor into clean energy, and China invested 35 billion, or almost 0.4% of the GDP. In terms of percent of the GDP, it's 3 times of the United States. And another telling story is really when you compare how the two countries spend their money in military versus climate spending. So for China, it's between $2 to $3 spent on military for every dollar spent on climate. And for the US, the ratio is really large. For year 2010, for every dollar spent on climate, $94 is spending on military, and in 2011, it's down to 41 to 1, still very large. So it really shows you like it's not like country like the US don't have the resources to spend on climate change, but it's a priority of the country. And another common narrative during and after Copenhagen is that China's pledged the target of 40 to 45% carbon intensity reduction is only business as usual, because for the last several years, China is already on the downward trend of carbon intensity decreases, so there's no extra efforts needs to put in to achieve the China's target of 40 to 45%. But when you actually just look at the number, just what happened to China's carbon intensity for the last decade, you realize that narrative is not true, because actually at the beginning of the century, China experienced an increase of carbon intensity. So not only the carbon emissions are growing together with the GDP, actually it's growing faster than the GDP. So what happened is that really alarmed the Chinese government, and they put lots of measures into the 11th five-year plan, that's 2005 to 2010, trying to reverse that trend. And the downward trend of the carbon intensity decrease is largely effect of that policy measures. So for the 11th five-year plan, the Chinese government have the ambition to reduce national energy intensity by 20% within the 5 years, as well as to raise the proportion of non-fossil fuel energy in the primary energy supply by up to 10% by 2010 and 15% by 2020. And many of these measures, I would say, are no regret energy efficiency measures, but they are not painless. For example, to improve the energy efficiency of power plants, there's massive close down of small inefficient thermal power plants. And for example, between 2006 and 2009, more than 54 gigawatts generating capacity were closed, surpassing the national goal. And in terms of economics, it's an economic thing to do. It's estimated that because these small inefficient thermal power plants are being replaced by supercritical or supercritical power plants, and the efficiency gain kind of recover the cost at most 4.5 years. But it's really not without pain. It's estimated because of the close down of these small power plants, about 400,000 job posts were eliminated. So the state-owned enterprises, they had to step in to help to retrain and help people to find jobs for hundreds of thousands of people. So that tells you that yes, it has been mentioned earlier. Yes, for China's top-down planning strategy, there's advantage for that kind of measures. But later I will say these are actually the no-hanging fruit, and it's getting tougher. So another big development for the last 5 years is massive growth of wind, and why is that proper policy and technology domestication leads to huge cost reduction, make wind energy much more affordable. So, for example, within 5 years, the wind turbine cost per kilowatt installation decreased more than 50%. And the reason is that the cost was high because of high import cost. So the Chinese government introduced a new bidding process in 2006 that to encourage technology domestication, meaning turbines with domestic content over 70% can apply for extra subsidy of 600 yuan per kilowatt. And it's not meant to be a permanent subsidy for domestic producers. That would be unfair. So it's only that for each producer, only a maximum of 50 sets can enjoy this subsidy. So this subsidy is just provided as an incentive for newcomers to overcome the entry barrier. So this policy has proven to be very effective, but unfortunately it was scrapped in July 2011 under US pressure as the US filed a WTO case against China, claiming relevant policies, China's subsidies to wind and solar are incompatible with the WTO rules. So I think that's really another case will show you the conflict between trade policies and climate policies, and I think there's really lots of work needs to be done. But in China, this kind of case is really creating a very bad public impression that the West is not sincere about climate change. On the one hand, China is being blamed for its rising emissions, and on the other hand, China is being blamed for doing too much to support wind and solar energy. And so next come to the question is China doing enough? So as I already showed you with the data, even though China is still a developing country, it's already doing much more than the US. But when you look at the big picture, it's probably still not enough. And Kevin already gave you the very honest and brutal figures about the global situation. And so I will talk a little bit more about China's situation, but it's not only about climate, but about the whole resource constraint. Because when you look at the ecological footprint, for example, of the US lifestyle with the current US technology, it's like if every Chinese want to imitate the US lifestyle, about 1.1 Earth is needed for every Chinese to achieve an American lifestyle. It's needless to say that's impossible. So that's why Zhou Dadi, one very influential policy advisor, the former director of the Energy Research Institute of the government, said that high carbon development will kill itself. I think he means it literally, because when you look at China's energy mix, right now is more than 50% of oil. Actually, right now is more than 60% of oil, and 20% of natural gas consumption depends on import, while the known coal reserves will be exhausted in 41 years with the current level of consumption. And actually, with the current level of coal consumption is growing at 6 to 7%, that will be exhausted much faster. And within the last few years, China even become a net coal importer. And when you look at agriculture, it's also shows China's current development trajectory is not sustainable. We really need to adjust. So China is still more than 95% self-sufficient with the 3 major grains. rice, wheat, and corn, but it uses about 1/3 of the world chemical fertilizers to achieve that high yield. Needless to say, it's not sustainable. And Guangdong province, which is the economic engine of China's reform, that's export zone, and it's the envy of the other provinces. But on the agriculture side, it only produces about 40% of the grains needed for its population, and the rest has to be shipping from other provinces. And it's simply not a scalable model for other provinces, because if other provinces become like that, they need to import 60% of their food from other areas of the world. The world market is simply not enough for China to buy all the food it needed. And climate change is already an existing and growing threat to agriculture. So this figure shows hazard-affected and disaster-affected areas within China. So the higher bar shows the so-called hazard-affected areas, meaning areas has more than 10% yield reduction due to droughts, floods, and other weather-related events. And the lower bar areas with more than 30% yield reduction because natural disasters. So as we can see, there's a steady upward trend for areas that has been negatively affected by droughts and floods. That's why that in 2011, government announced a plan to invest 4 trillion yuan, which is more than $600 billion, into irrigation and rural waterworks by year 2020. So that's, I think, the government are fully aware of this challenge, and that's a magnitude of investment they are putting into as part of the adaptation to the climate change, the threat to agriculture by climate change. And this is a global food insecurity and climate change map put forward by World Food Program of the UN during the Cancun negotiations. So it's a measure of the prediction of the possibility of hunger due to climate change of different countries. So it's rated, it's 5 ranges from very low probability of food security to very high probability. So the darker the color, the higher the probability. So as we can see, India and some African countries fares pretty bad. They have very high probability of food insecurity, but China is just only slightly better. It's ranked 4 out of 5, a high probability to face food insecurity because of climate change. So the Chinese government is just like any government. It's not a uniform block. We have really different school of thoughts and competing ideas within the government. So for many people who are working on the actual issues of energy security, food security, so people, the technocrats more from the natural science background, many of them realize that the limit as constraint on growth is physical and biological, and that's a natural limit. That's a way. There's no way we can negotiate with that. That's a growth paradigm. Has to be changed. And so many of these people consider that constraint posed by the international regime can be considered if it's fair and science-based. And that's one reason that China's pledges under Copenhagen and Cancun Agreement are unilateral and conditional. It's because those technocrats pushed the government saying this China itself needs to do for its own sustainable development. No matter what happens with the international climate negotiations. And right now, even some scholars are proposing to put an absolute carbon cap on certain rich provinces starting from now, and a long-term cap for 2020 for the whole country. But unfortunately, I would say this school of thought has been undermined by the international climate negotiations in the last several years. It's like the China bashing game during and after Copenhagen is so bad. Actually, just right after the Chinese negotiation went to home, they immediately got the criticism that their whole strategy for Copenhagen was wrong. They shouldn't put the pledge as unconditional and unilateral. They should have played the game as the EU did to play the hard bargain, to put their higher level of the pledge as unconditional. And what's especially sad is that for many people who are working on geopolitics, international politics, who don't have a strong science background, that the dynamics of international climate negotiations makes them feel that climate change is not so real. The West does not behave that they really consider climate change is a very serious threat themselves. But it's more like it's a Western conspiracy to constrain the developing countries, to constrain the growth of China and India. So that's the sad consequences of the China bashing game during and after Copenhagen, that it has probably pushed more Chinese to become climate skeptics than all the Western skeptics combined. And so, for example, before Copenhagen, when I visited Beijing that summer, one senior policy advisor asked me, how can international negotiation facilitate more domestic action, because his technocrats from a natural science background, he really felt like China needs to do more domestically. But after Copenhagen, when I met him several times, including this summer when I was in China, he told me that now he said we shouldn't talk about no carbon anymore because the world has become poisoned. It's like actually in the Chinese version of Wikipedia, we even have an entry called no carbon plot with references of published articles and even books about how the so-called low-carbon plot is a Western conspiracy to constrain the growth of developing countries. So this policy advisor, the senior policy advisor of the government told me that that's why we cannot talk no carbon anymore. We should talk about energy security instead. And now his question is, how can we build a firewall to prevent international climate politics from doing further damage? And yes, there's advantage of China's top-down planning model, but I think with public opinions really started to doubt climate change, I think many of the the central government policies on low-carbon development will be compromised. That's one of the challenges we are trying to address within the country. But I think the problem is that the West is largely ignorant of the internal dynamics within China. For example, after Copenhagen, during one of the Reuters report, the report says, officially acknowledge privately that the mandatory system for enforcing emission curbs created by the Kyoto Protocol is doomed because China won't accept any constraints on its future economic growth, and the United States won't join any agreement that is not binding on Beijing. At least on China, I think it's a very dangerously wrong assessment, because it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, we do have factions in China who say China shouldn't accept any constraints on its future economic growth. But on the other hand, we also have people from very strong natural science background who say these are the natural boundaries we have to respect, and if international agreement pose boundaries which are fair and science-based, we should consider to accept that. But by totally ignoring all these more progressive elements within the government, it's continuing undermine them, and actually is pushing China towards the wrong direction, to becoming more like the US. And there's no doubt that China needs to change, but the problem is that when Western politicians talk about that, oftentimes it can be very counterproductive. So for example, President Obama was interviewed last year by Australia Broadcasting Commission. So during that interview, he said, if over 1 billion Chinese citizens have the same living patterns as Australians and Americans do right now, then all of us are in for a very miserable time. The planet just cannot sustain it. So they, meaning the Chinese government, understand that they've got to make a decision about a new model that is more sustainable, which is perfectly true. That's often the message I'm trying to convey whenever I talk to a Chinese audience. But the problem is that when President Obama talked about it, without even ever mentioning the need for either Americans or Australians to change, it's not helpful. So when this was translated and reported in China, the dominant response from Chinese readers is, why should we Chinese conserve resources so that Americans and Australians can continue their way? So China is really like a microcosm of the world. So first, all this equity talk, all this different carbon budget approach as suggested by various Chinese and Western scholars does not give China or India a blank check for them to go on business as usual. For example, even with convergence of cumulative per capita emissions, China will use up its carbon budget between 2040 and 2050 with its current trajectory. So that's why equity discussion is within China is important too. Otherwise, it's like otherwise the rich within China also get out of jail free card to imitate the U.S. So within the country, we also have alarming polarization between the rich and the poor. The Gini coefficient is more than 0.45%, and the per capita GDP ratio of the richest province and the poorest province is more than 8:1, roughly similar to the U.S. versus China ratio. So, and also within China, that's why we think it's important to preserve the top-down model is that with a pledge and review system, with China, which is such a big country, actually all the provinces, they want the pledge and review system instead of a top-down science-based system because each provinces also don't want to do much. So Su Wei, China's head negotiator, also admits that he also faces very tough negotiations at home with the province head to distribute the national target down to the province level. But so what happens internationally also have the implications domestically. If we don't have the top-down science model globally, which if it's abolished, then within China, the provinces have a strong saying, we also want a pledge and review system, and that means provinces just pledge what they like to do, and which means very likely China as a whole cannot deliver its national target. And during some private conversations, some Chinese experts acknowledge that the need to change is that no matter how much ecological space we still have, if we don't change the current growth model, the rich cities will use up most of it, leaving little spaces for rural areas to develop. It's almost a very sad mirror image of the world where rich countries like the US continue to use up the remaining atmosphere space, leaving very little space for developing countries to develop. So this is what Glen Peters talked earlier in terms of the consumption-based emission, and so this shows China's export and China's emission. You can say that China entered WTO in 2001, and you can say that after that, within decade, China's export, the red line really went up rapidly, and which is very clearly coupled with China's emissions. So it's estimated that China's net exports add up to about 23% of the country's emissions. It's comparable to Japan's emission is quite large. So that's also shows that Glen Peters' message that we really, how do we address that we cannot simply relocate the emissions. We really have to look at a consumption-based accounting and how develop policies to address them. This also have domestic implications for China, because right now we do have common but differentiated responsibility to different provinces, that the rich provinces have a higher target, while the less developed regions have a lower target. But how can we prevent that the rich regions simply outsource their carbon emissions to poor regions? That's the challenge the country have to face.
Sorry, are you rounding off?
Yes, I'm rounding off. So I'm rounding off with another. So before Cancun, Hans Josef Fell, one of the German Green Parliament members, when he asked about his expectation about Cancun, he answered, "I don't have much hope for Cancun." Then he added that, "Yet I have great hope for China. China has the world's biggest reforestation project and the fastest growing renewable sector. We can all learn something from China." That's very comforting to hear from a Western politician. But for myself, I have a more mixed feelings. On the positive side, yes, China's leadership do take science very seriously, because about 80 to 90% of the Chinese leadership come from the natural science or engineering background. It's quite different from the US, which is largely run by lawyers. And so that's why that China is going full gear on energy efficiency and renewables. These are very important first steps. But on the other hand, I think the energy efficiency and renewables are probably will not be sufficient, and we have to address the consumption and lifestyle issues, because the imitation of the US lifestyle is simply a dead end. But unfortunately, the hope to discuss this front has really been dampened by international climate politics. Because the challenge is that no matter what the technocrats in the government wants to do, for the general public, the common mentality is China should do what the West does, not what the West says. So the question is, how do we get the message across, as they are really bombarded with messages about the glamorous American dream, the consumer lifestyle. So we really need a more action and more positive examples from the West, so we can jointly step up the efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Really interesting to have you present the perspective from the Chinese side. So both clearly a need for reducing territorial emissions or domestic emissions, as well as nearly a quarter that is export related, yes, and is something for us to think about and discuss further here. Are there any immediate